I'm Rachel Lampard, and I've worked for the Methodist Church for a number of years now, helping churches to explore what it means, in the words of Micah, to act justly, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God, to follow a God of justice in an unjust world, and to think, pray, speak, and act as justice-seeking Christians. The very word justice is a tricky one, isn't it? It means so many different things to each one of us, and much of this will depend on our own past experiences. Perhaps for you, it has echoes of a legal system, righting wrongs with justice sought or justice denied. Perhaps it's about basic needs of food, water, shelter, education. Perhaps it's about fairness, with groups needing scarce resources or to have their rights recognised. Or perhaps it's a table turning, world upside down idea where nothing can be the same again. What does God's justice look like? You began this service with 6 principles for justice. These were adopted by the Methodist Conference as a foundation, a simple picture of what we believe about God's justice. Now, these are starting points. They're not tools for winning arguments. They're aids to help us as we wrestle and discern as we encounter injustice in the world and in our lives. What do we believe about God's justice? And therefore, what does that mean for us in seeking God's justice? In the news this week, we've seen the continuing violence, death, and hunger in Gaza, the failure of a deal to release Israeli hostages, and rising tensions and conflict around the Middle East. We've had the warmest January day on record in Scotland, with climate change causing a drought in the Amazon basin. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has reported that 3 in 10 children are living poverty in the UK, and a third of disabled people. In our own lives, we may be experiencing or witnessing other forms of injustice, oppression, or exploitation. What is God saying to us today? Today's gospel is an apparently disjointed story in 3 parts. Jesus goes to Simon and Andrew's house, where he heals Simon's mother-in-law. Later, the house is surrounded by people who are sick, and Jesus cures many of them. And then he goes off to pray, before being hunted down by the disciples and heading off to Galilee, proclaiming and casting out demons. Now, this isn't one of the passages that we typically turn to when we want to think or indeed preach about justice. But I wonder if there are a number of things that this reading is saying to us and asking of us today. Firstly, what does justice look like? This is the first healing story of Mark's Gospel. Now, healing stories can be complicated. For some people listening today, you may have a personal testimony of healing which has shaped your life. For others, what has felt like a lack of healing may have left a sense of unease or sadness. For many people who live with disability, their experience of preaching and praying on healing narratives has been painful, failing to recognise the brokenness of society for excluding disabled people and the blessing of disability. As Amy Kenny wrote pointedly, "My body is not a prayer request." Just think about many of Jesus's healing miracles. The woman who'd been bleeding for many years, for example, or the people with leprosy. Jesus's healing was about the brokenness of society and the need for restoration. Jesus restored people within a society that had excluded them because of perceptions about their illness, a society which had judged them to be unclean or beyond the pale, a society which broke relationship with them. Jesus restored people, but he also restored that bit of society which was broken, that relationship which was spoiled, therefore enabling people to be fully human, fully able to participate again. Simon's nameless mother-in-law had a fever, so she was not only potentially infectious, but she was also a woman. What did Jesus do? He reached out and he touched her, and he lifted her up. He broke the taboo, the fear, the exclusion, and by healing the woman, restored her to be part of the community. Now, it's always a bit surprising to me at this point that she's not told to go and have a lie down and a cup of tea to recover from her near-death experience, but instead, she immediately starts to serve her guests. But perhaps this shows that she has had her rightful place as host restored to her by Jesus' touch. And perhaps this is a natural response to the good news of the gospel, a desire to serve. So what does this tell us? Something of what justice looks like. This is a telling of a healing miracle, but throughout the Bible, we see stories that justice is about the restoration of right relationship, of people's God-given worth that's been denied to them and is now restored, of human communities made whole because those who've been excluded are now included. This picture of God's justice is always rather challenging because it makes me ask, where am I in this story? I may have experienced exclusion, but how much more have I been responsible for or a participant in excluding people? Is it easier sometimes to be part of a church or a community which is self-selecting? Or do I judge people or choose not to share? If justice is about being in right relationship, how can we seek justice in our personal relationships, in our churches, in our communities, as well as in our politics? In an election year, how will we challenge our politicians about what needs to be done to restore right relationships? Secondly, this passage asks us to think about how we seek justice. Time after time, we find Jesus in the middle of people, surrounded by crowds, preaching outdoors. Here we read that at sundown, all who were sick or possessed were brought to him. Indeed, the whole city was gathered around the door, all of it overwhelming. Being sick or mentally ill or disabled meant that you couldn't work. And without a health service or a welfare state, you were going to be reliant on the charity of others, conscious that your family were being dragged into poverty because of your ill health. These people around Jesus were the poorest of the poor, living in an occupied state. John Wesley, one of the founders of Methodism, said that we should go not to those who need us, but to those who need us most. And that is where we find Jesus. And if it's true in the Bible, then surely it's true in the world. God is already at what we call the margins of our society. And this surely challenges us about how we seek justice. Because God is a with God, a God who pitched his tent in the neighborhood, who lived among us, died and rose again, a God who is with us. If we also need to be with in order to seek justice, what does that look like? I've got a friend who's a professor. He's also a wheelchair user. He was waiting at the edge of a street one day when he felt someone grab the back of his wheelchair and start to push him across the road. He said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the person behind him said, "Don't worry, I was crossing anyway." My friend said, "But I didn't want to cross the road." But by that point, the person had deposited him on the opposite pavement and wandered off, probably feeling very pleased that they'd done a good thing. I wonder whether this is sometimes our instinctive approach to seeking justice. We see people as problems to be solved. We do justice to people or for people, rather than being with them or asking them what they want. I met a group of Methodist women in Britain recently who talked about how they've been trying to support a group of asylum seekers living nearby. They thought they'd organise a collection of clothes for them, but decided to ask the women of the families if that would be helpful. The women thanked them, but said, "We'd really like to make our own clothes. We're excellent at making clothes. And actually, we can make what we and our families need to wear. But what we need are sewing machines." So that's what the Methodist women in Britain did instead. They found sewing machines. They were with people, asking what their needs were, instead of assuming that they knew. Jesus is to be found with people, the people who need him most. What are the ways in which our justice seeking might be reoriented to be more with people rather than to do to them or for them? Asking people what they want and responding to their skills, like the seamstress refugee women. Enabling people to have dignity and choice and agency, such as being able to participate in running your own community pantry to tackle poverty. Joining with other community organisations to use our collective power to achieve change together, as shown through local citizens group. This Bible passage reminds us of the challenge of seeking justice by being with rather than doing to people. Finally, justice seeking is rooted in our God of justice. Jesus could have stayed a miracle worker. He had the whole city at his door, after all. But we see at the end of this passage that he retreats. He goes out while it's still dark to a deserted place to pray. And he tells the disciples who come looking for him that his calling is to proclaim the message. I heard Justin Welby once remind a group of Christians that churches aren't charities with pointy roofs. We are called to seek justice, but we're called to do this in response to God's love. As we heard in the words of Micah, what does God require of us but to do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with God? These aren't three separate instructions, but they're bound together, woven inextricably together. We experience God's amazing love, and that breaks our heart at the brokenness of God. We play our part in restoring right relationship, in sharing God's love with others. And precisely in doing this, we learn more about God's character and the pattern of God's kingdom. The Methodist Church longs to be a growing, inclusive, evangelistic, and justice-seeking church. To misquote Corinthians, we can't say, "I am justice-seeking, you are evangelistic." We're all rooted in a God of love and justice. We proclaim the good news for all, and that is about God's transformation of all things. I was talking this week with a minister who has a growing number of Iranian asylum seekers coming to her church. Originally, the church was involved in providing food and clothing for asylum seekers who were living nearby. As more Iranians came along, they themselves started to be involved in cooking the food and coming along to church and participating in worship. The minister has recently started running membership classes for them. When she asked them why they wanted to become Christians, one of them said, "I first heard about the church when my friend said it was a place where you would find love, and I wanted to be part of that place." I want to be part of that place too. A church that welcomes, that listens, that makes space, that speaks out and enables others to speak out, that joins together with others for change, that puts its money where its morals are, that shows that things can be different, that seeks right relationship, that is with people, that shares the good news of God's love. This is a justice-seeking church. Loving God, help us as we seek to act justly, to love kindness, and walk humbly and ever more closely with you. Amen.